Hello and welcome. Just some thoughts on a way to read Nietzsche's Zarathustra um, as a contest to the bourgeois domesticating or bourgeois notions of domesticity. Um, it's quite clear that Nietzsche is trying to, with dynamite, as he said, blow something up, and it's interesting to wonder what exactly he's trying to blow up. There is two sections in Zarathustra which I think point towards this quite clearly. One section called Before Sunrise, which is basically a love letter to the open sky, to something kind of big, vast, and so forth. And he even proclaims, I'll read the quote, all my wandering and mountain climbing, it was merely a necessity and an expedient of clumsiness. My whole will desires only to fly into you. And then he talks about clouds, passing clouds, as these bad mediators and these mediators and mixers, half and halfers who have learned neither to bless nor to curse from the heart. If you keep reading that section, you see that he makes a direct comparison of the clouds to this good and evil. He wants to go beyond good and evil, this moral framework, which clearly in Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals, other Nietzschean texts, that he wants to go beyond. But in order to go beyond, there's this interesting kind of spatial and even kind of quasi-militaristic analogies. As I mentioned before, dynamite. And so we're in a sort of container, a moral framework. Clouds are something which block out the sky. They sort of enclose us. Even clouds are analogized with emotions like depression, even weather. The way we describe the weather is actually quite similar to emotion. Um, Tension, pressure, depression, high and low pressure, all this kind of stuff. Thunderous, gloomy. So the clouds are a unfavorable roofing, something which blocks out the openness of the white space. I'm good. Actually, what would be helpful in certain passages would be to look at Nietzsche, similar to how Peter Sloterdijk is looking at spatial analogies and kind of spatial thinking, which he takes from Heidegger's Being and Dwelling, or was it Dwelling, Being, Thinking, or what? I can't remember the exact title of the essay, but it's Heidegger's brief attempt to use basically his kind of Heideggerian phenomenology to understand space as well as time. And he never really did this thoroughly, which is the whole motivation for Sloterdijk's Spheres trilogy, which is a big 3,000 page, nearly 3 books. They're about 900 pages each. Exploration of a kind of phenomenology of space. There's definitely something to be said for some of Nietzsche's rhetoric regarding this, especially if we were to look at Nietzsche as someone who is trying to escape from something, a kind of claustrophobic moral framework, often quite explosively. In the next section preceding Before Sunrise, there's a section in Zarathustra called "Of the Virtue That Makes Small," and this section is basically when Zarathustra encounters a row of houses, and he kind of thinks about the houses, and houses are important, obviously, because houses are dwellings, and he contemplates whether these houses are making people bigger or smaller. He's got some funny rhetoric to describe them. He says, "What do these houses mean? Truly, no great soul put them up in it as its image. Did a silly child perhaps take them out of its toy box? If only another child would put them back in its box. And these sitting rooms and bedrooms, are men able to go in and out of them? They seem to have been made for dolls, or dainty nibblers who perhaps let others nibble with them. So these are houses made for dolls." And Nietzsche's not sure whether you can go in and out of them. So this is a dwelling of a dwelling for small creatures, dolls, and perhaps dwellings where you once you go into them, it's very hard to get out of them. He then says, Zarathustra stopped and considered. At length he said, sadly, everything has become smaller. Everywhere I see lower doors. Anyone like me can still pass through them, but he has to stoop. This is, comparable to Nietzsche's frequent rhetoric about taming, about turning a wolf into a house pet. The domestic analogies, the kind of polemic with a certain domesticizing attempt, has in this section been kind of expressed through these analogies of dwelling, space, housing. Taming, in the polemic sense, is stooping. And he then says, "Oh, when shall I return to my home, where I shall no longer have to stoop, before small men?" So this stooping is also attached somewhat to a kind of resentment, because you invite another man into your home just to watch him stoop, just to see him lower himself. There's this sort of architecturally enshrined resentment, we could even say. The rest of the section just basically kind of goes on in a sort of polemic way, in which a kind of slave morality is expressed through analogies of housing and dwelling and so forth. Ultimately, the usual Nietzschean critique, which is that some sort of ethic or some sort of virtue, which is concealing mediocrity or cowardice, is being transvalued into mediocrity becomes moderation, cowardice becomes compassion, and so forth. But it's interesting to see these housing and domestic references, because a lot of Zarathustra is a man who is a wanderer. He lives in a mountain, he lives in a cave, he goes to a town, he leaves again, and so forth. He's always looking for open spaces like deserts, mountains, and big, vast, cosmic night skies. And he's reluctant and suspicious of places which are too domestic. And in reference to this kind of slave morality, which Nietzsche's always critiquing, which is a kind of self-deception, one can see that perhaps the open night sky is preferable for very honest souls, because in a sense our housing can deceive us. And if our housing, and this is very important for the internet era, because the internet is part of our housing now, right? Our social housing. what social circles, what we see. We can be very selective of it, and we can frame our experience of the world in order to block things out, in order to make things which are very, very trivial seem much larger than they are. So things about myself, I'm so amazing, look at me. I like social media is basically one giant expression of ego inflation. Well, maybe not ego inflation, maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's something to do with the superego, but anyway, we don't even have to frame it that way. We could just say something like social media is one big way of, and I think this is relevant to Marshall McLuhan and his Global Village, which I'm planning on reading, but I know the basic outline of it, which is this big world network of media does not make us really, really cosmopolitan and really worldly and well cultured. It actually makes us very, very parochial and very trivial. Everyone's nosing around in everyone's business the whole time. But it also helps us inflate things about ourselves. That within the extreme control over our kind of dwelling, our social spheres, and so forth, that we can sort of adapt everything to exaggerate things about ourselves which are very trivial and very unimportant and insignificant, and make them really significant. This is basically the point of Instagram and Facebook and all these things, right? Whereas the Zarathustrian soul wants the big open sky, because he wants to see how small he is. He wants to feel that. In order to become big, you have to realize your insignificance. Whereas the people that remain small have a tendency to inflate their insignificance, but they can only inflate their significance, but they can only inflate their significance by creating very, very stooping small structures around them. Big fish in a small pond is the kind of typical analogy we use here. So within this provincialism and this parochialism, which Zarathustra is always encountering and very reluctant and doesn't like it, and he's always trying to find space outside of it. You see a sort of spatial and dwelling analogy of how resentment and how transvaluation and self-deception can actually take on almost kind of like spatial and architectural forms. What else can we learn about Zarathustra's critique of domesticity as it stands, or as it stood in his time, or maybe as it stands in some degree eternally? One section, Zarathustra writes, "You will become smaller and smaller, you small people. You will crumble away, you comfortable people. You will yet perish through your many small virtues, through your many small omissions, through your many small submissions." He's kind of rapping almost at this stage. "Too indulgent, too yielding, that is the state of your soil. But in order to grow big, a tree wants to strike hard roots into hard rocks." So a kind of Zarathustrian understanding of growth and of getting bigger means that you have to strike hard roots into hard rocks, which means harsh conditions are actually suitable for growth. Now, with plants, at least, like, plants, if you're growing like vegetables or something, it's very simple. You need to give them a certain amount of water, a certain amount of sunlight, good soil, some space. It's very kind of obvious what to do. Where with humans, it's very different. Good conditions can turn into bad conditions if they're extremely, let's say, kind of unchallenging, or don't invoke a sense of the need to expand, overcome roots, strong roots in in hard rocks. Basically, strength comes not from an extremely comfortable existence, but from something else. And that something else is still kind of somewhat mysterious. What exactly? I mean, if we knew the world to be a great place, how real humans are formed. But it's clear that a certain notion of comfort, of domesticity, is very crippling and suffocating for the real growth and real expansion of human beings to become something worth being.